Parev, Pariegak. Hello everyone, welcome or perhaps welcome back to me teaching you how to do Armenian needlework, now in English because this is much easier for me. In this video, I'm going to show you how to work a foundational row of Armenian needle lace into fabric edging, as well as show you 3 different patterns that you can use for standalone edgings for table linens, or also as stitches in a larger design. All you need to get started with Armenian needle lace is a needle, some thread, and a piece of scrap fabric. I'm using size 40 Lisbeth thread, which is a really strong 6-cord tatting thread and one of my personal favorites. If this is your first time trying needle lace though, I would recommend using something a little bit larger like size 10 or size 20 crochet thread, or even pearl cotton if you have that on hand already. And you can get all of these at pretty much any craft store if you don't have it already. Just stay away from stranded embroidery floss because it's a much looser ply since the strands are divisible and it'll look fuzzy once you're tying knots. For the first row, you'll want to use a relatively sharp needle to go through the fabric layers, but if you don't like poking yourself, a tapestry needle is fine for the rest of the pattern rows. So I just drew pencil lines so I knew where I'd want my fold to go, but if you're doing this on the edge of a piece of fabric, I would recommend doing your hem first and then coming back and doing the edging afterwards, because I think it looks a lot nicer if you already have that hem flattened out. But since this is just a scrap piece of fabric, it's not super important. So we're going to start by going down into the fold. This is about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit less. And we'll take the end of our string, put it on top of the needle like this. And then this side that's in the eye, we're going to take and we're going to wrap around below the needle and come back. And then pull this. You want to get a nice knot just where you have that fold. So we'll come down right next to it. We'll do the same thing. We want to keep the long end of the thread right on top of the needle, and then take this side, wrap it around from right to left, and pull. So this is where you want to pay attention to how your tension is. If you keep this loop here too tight, then you'll start to bunch up all your fabric. But if it's too loose, then it gets difficult to make sure that they're all the same size. So I like to do them about like this. It's not a huge loop, but it's not so tight that I'm bunching up all the fabric. So do the same thing. Come down 1/8 of an inch below the fold, keep this thread on top, then take the other end, wrap it around the back from right to left, and pull. You want to make sure you're pulling pretty tight. This lace is all knots, and the knots are what will keep it together. So if your knots are too loose, then you run the risk of it unraveling later if it gets snagged or cut on something. But as long as you keep them really tight, it stays pretty hardy, and it can stand up to a lot of use in washing. So we'll keep doing the same thing all the way to the end of the row. And if you get a tangle like this, you can just slide the needle in between those threads and pull it up. Usually it'll come right out. You can also do this to adjust the size of the loop that you have. If it's too big or too small, you can put the needle in there, release the knot, and then adjust the size however you want it. So now we're getting to the end of the row, and my heater just turned on. Hopefully there's not too much background noise. Just doing the last few stitches here. And I think this will be a good ending point. So I always like to make the last stitch extra tight and extra secure, so make sure you pull that last knot really well. And from here you can clip this off. So if you're using this as the foundation row for a longer edging, like we'll do in the next few patterns, don't clip it right at the knot. Leave yourself maybe an inch or two, just in case because you don't want to loosen this knot when you're working in this stitch in the next row. But since this is just our foundation row, I'll go ahead and clip this right at the end. And then we can do the same thing at the beginning. Leave the thread if you're going to be working another row on top of this, but if that's all you're doing, then go ahead and clip it. Here we have our first row of Armenian lace worked into the fabric. So now we are going to learn how to do this design right here. I have seen this called prodints or rice stitch. I think in the Priscilla book they just call it fancy side stitch or something like that. You can call it whatever you want, it doesn't really matter. So we're going to start off using the same foundational row that we just learned. So that's the first row, and then come back around and work exactly the same way for the second row. And then in the third row is where we come in and add these picots. I don't know how well that's showing up on camera, but the stitch is made by making a picot in the stitch that we just worked and then moving on to the next stitch. So now we'll start off exactly the same way as we did before, with the tail of the thread here and working 1/8 of an inch below the fold, and then wrap the thread around. Wrap the thread around from right to left. And we'll just continue this way all the way to the end of the row. And this time, since we are working something on top of it, you do want to pay attention and make sure that you're keeping these loops even and the same size. And again, if you make one of them too big, you can just slide the needle in to loosen that knot up, and then adjust the size however you want. So I'm reaching the end of my fabric here, and you have two choices for what you can do next. You can cut your thread and go back to the beginning and work the second row from left to right again, or you could go from your last stitch and work from right to left. So I'm going to show working from right to left. I think that it's a little bit quicker than cutting off and going back to the beginning. So I'll make this my last stitch here. Okay. So we have our first row finished. And now we're going to work the second row the same way, except now we're going to work from right to left. So I'll rethread your needle. So I'm going to start by going back into the very final loop that I worked. So my needle is going underneath this loop. And then we'll do the same thing where we want to have the tail end of the thread going on top of the needle, and then the other end that's closer to the eye is going to twist around from right to left. And we'll pull. And since we're at the edge of the row, you just want a small loop, small enough to get you into the center of this stitch, and then the rest of the loops from here will be normal. So now we go into the second to last stitch, put the tail end of the thread over the needle, and then wrap the other end around from right to left. And pull. My thread's getting a little bit short, so to add a new one in a second. So I'll leave this tail here and then cut off a new piece. Normally I like to work with about 5 feet, but since we're just doing these edgings, I'm using shorter pieces. Okay, so when we're adding new thread in, I'm going to put the tail of the new piece of thread behind the tail of the old piece. And then the needle is going to go in the same stitch that we were in before. And we'll wrap around from right to left. Same way we always do. And then pull that tight. So you want to catch both tails, the old tail and the new tail, in that knot, and it should be pretty secure. Okay, so now we can continue our row. The needle inside the stitch, the tail goes in front, and then the other end from right to left. Do the same thing, tail in front, and then other end right to left. And we'll keep working like this until we get back to the beginning. And when you add that new thread, just make sure that you don't catch the tails as you're working the rest of the row. So we're coming up on the last few stitches now. Okay, so now I'm back in the first stitch that I worked. So I'm going to work a second stitch into the same one to make a small loop. And only for this first one, you want your second stitch to go to the left of the first stitch to get a loop like this. That's pretty small. So next, you're going to put your needle inside that loop that you just made. Then make a stitch as normal, the tail end of the thread on top, and then wrap the other end around from right to left. And then we'll pull. So now the thread is coming out of the top of this little picot that we just made. And we can work into the second stitch. You want to check your tension to make sure you're getting a good sized loop here. And pull that tight. We'll work a second knot into the same stitch we just went into. But this time it'll be to the right of our knot. Leaving a small loop so we can go into the loop that we just made. And then come out on the top of that picot. So we'll keep going like that. Make our first stitch into the next loop on the row below. Pull it tight. Make a second smaller stitch to the right of it. And that makes a little picot. Then we'll go inside of that stitch that we just made. And if you get knots in your thread, try to gently pull them out. You shouldn't have to cut them out. Most of the time you can get them apart with your needle or your fingers if you need to. So we'll keep going like this. Since that one is a little too big, I'll loosen this knot up just a little bit with the needle, and then tighten it once the loop is the size that I like this. I'm coming up to the end of my row now. This is the second to last stitch. This will be the last picot that we do. So you can't, if you like to have sort of this diagonal line on your edge, you can stop right there and clip it off. Or if you want to have a straighter edge, then actually you can go ahead and do one more picot. But if you do that, you don't want to end on the top of the picot. You want to keep the line straight, so I'll come in to this, the very first stitch that we made on the second row, the small one. And do one more knot like that. And then you just want to shape this one to give you a flat edge. Like that. So there is the rice stitch. Or the fancy side stitch, depending on what book you're looking at. Now we're going to learn the mount ararat stitch. So for this one, we start off the foundation the same way, but you need a multiple of 3 plus 1 stitches. So it's 3 for every peak of the mountain, and then plus 1 extra at the very end to round everything off evenly. So we're gonna start out exactly the same way as we did before. With our folded edge and going 1/8 of an inch down into the fold, wrapping around. And again, here you want to pay attention to the loop size. They're not too big, not too small, because you don't want to have a lot of extra thread hanging around, and at the same time you don't want to bunch the fabric up. Okay, I finished my first row. So I did 28 stitches, which is enough for 9 peaks plus 1 extra to tie everything off evenly. So we're going to join our thread back into the first stitch that we made. The needle goes in under the tail of the working thread, and we wrap this side around the same way we always do. Now I'm going to make 3 stitches. Now I'm going to go back into the first stitch that I made for this row, carry the thread over from the end back to the beginning, and you want this to lay pretty flat. And then we're going to wrap the needle end of the thread around from right to left. And as you pull this in, make sure that the end that you brought around is laying nice and straight against the other stitches. There. So now we'll go in to the middle stitch, the 3 that we just made, and the needle is going into that stitch and also underneath the second thread that we brought around, and underneath the working end of the thread. So we'll make a stitch like we normally do. And you can see that this kind of makes a triangular loop shape, so it looks a little bit different than the ones we did before. We'll do that again, going in to the 3rd stitch that we made. We get another triangular loop. Now we'll go back to the beginning of this row, bring the tail over, pull that through, go into the 2nd stitch of the previous row, underneath the thread we passed over, underneath this tail, and finish our knot. So now we have most of our pyramid, or Mount Ararat, done. We're going to go back into the very top stitch, bring this thread over the needle again, pass the knot through, so we're at the top, and now we want to go into this stitch right here. So this is the 4th stitch in the very first row. And we're going to make another knot to bring the thread down from the peak of the mountain to our foundational row. And you want to check the tension on here because, again, you don't want it to be too tight so that you're distorting the shape, but you also don't want it to be so loose that it could get snagged on something. So it should just follow the same line that your knot's made. So now we'll do this again. We'll make 3 knots. Go back to the first stitch for this mountain. And keeping the tension on the thread nice and even. And then come back to the second stitch of the first row, underneath the thread that we brought over, underneath the tail of the working thread. And then finish the knot. We do the same thing for the next stitch in this row. Now that we're at the end, we're going to go back to the beginning. Do the same thing again. Now there's only 1 stitch left at the top, so we come back into the top stitch, tie our knot, and then jump down into the bottom. I'll do that same thing all the way across the row. So I'm down to the last 2 peaks. Okay, now for the last one. It fits right in here. Luckily I counted correctly. And just be careful that you don't catch the tail end of the first row in your knots here. Now I'll go down into the very last stitch on the first row. If it's too big, you can slide the needle in to loosen the knot. And then adjust the length of that thread. Okay, so we're at the end of the row. You want to make sure that you pull the last knot really tight. And since we're done with this pattern, now we can clip all the threads. So I'm going to clip right up against the knot. And I'll do the same thing for the tail from the first row. Make sure you don't cut the knot, just cut against the knot. And then I'll also clip these ones over here where I add a new thread. And same thing from the beginning threads. So there is our finished Mount Ararat design. Oh, I didn't finish clipping. It's hard to see. The tripod is between my face and my hands. So I'm watching myself in the monitor. Okay, now I've got everything clipped. Okay, the last pattern that we have is the Mushy or small almond pattern. So for this one, you need any odd number of stitches. You can make it look like this. I like to do it where we have the almonds going over one stitch in the foundation row. You could do it over two if you want to. Then you have to change the number of foundation stitches you have accordingly. So instead of doing any odd number, you'd have to do a multiple of 3 and then plus 1. So I already started, or I finished my first row. This is, I think, 27 stitches. So I'm gonna go into the first stitch like normal. Oh. Okay. Go into my first stitch. Make that knot. So now all the way across, we're going to skip one stitch and then go into the second stitch. You want to keep gentle curve on that so that you get the nice oval almond shape. And now just keep doing the same pattern all the way across. So I finished the second row, where we just did a stitch in every other stitch from the first row. Now I want to come back to the beginning of the second row. I'll tie on into the first stitch. And now we want to make another knot right next to this first knot that we made without leaving a loop. So you'll pull the thread tightly across the needle. And while you're pulling the knot closed, make sure you're staying all the way against the first knot that you made so that they end up being right next to each other, like that. So now what we want to do is make these Pico shapes right here. So we want to make 3 taller loops, taller skinny loops. So I started off my knot, and I'm pulling it most of the way closed, but not all the way tight. And I'm going to adjust the size of this loop using my needle. And once I'm satisfied with how that looks, I'll go ahead and tighten this up. So that one's a little big. So I'll come loosen this knot just a little bit, and then pull the end of the thread to get that tight. And then you can pull up on that loop with the needle. So do the same thing. I tightened it most of the way, and now this time I have something to measure against. So I want to make this second loop the same size as the first loop, and that looks like it's a little bit too big. So I'll just let a little bit of thread out of the knot and tighten it. Now I can pull it up and see that those are pretty close to the same size. We'll do a third one. And that looks pretty good. So we still have the rest of the space to fill before we can get to the second almond pattern. So to close that space, we'll make some more, it's like invisible stitches where we're just putting the knots down right against each other with no loops in between them. I'll do one more. So now I'll go into the second loop in the second row, make a knot, pull it tight, and I like to pull this to the left so to kind of close the gap between the last stitch from the first almond and the first stitch in the second almond. So we have our first stitch, we'll make a knot right next to it, now we'll start our picots. There's one. There's two. I'll pull that up a little more. And there's three. So now we can fill in the rest of the space. And depending on how big or small these loops are here, you may have to add more of the small knots or fewer. You can do that before or after you do the picot. So I think these are looking a little bit lopsided. So for the next few, I'll probably do 3 or 4 small knots before I start the picots. So I do my first stitch into the next almond, pull it towards the previous one to get everything nice and tight together. There's the second knot. I'll do one more to get the picots nice and centered. There's 3 small knots. The first one, and I have a knot in the thread that I need to get out. There. So we'll come back and do a second picot. And here is the third one. I'll just pull this loop up so that it matches the other two. There, and that looks like it'll be pretty centered, so I can go ahead and do 3 more small knots on the other side. Just 1. There's 2. And there's 3. So you'll keep doing the same pattern all the way across. Alright, here are the finished patterns. I pressed this so the lace will lay flat, but clearly not super well because now it's wrinkled. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them either here or on Instagram, and I'm hoping I can make more of these in the future, but we'll see. Så det är så